The bitter October wind howled across the plains of Colorado Territory as Abigail Norwood stared at the smoldering remains of her wagon. Tears streaked her dirt-smudged face while the last of her worldly possessions crackled in the flames. The 1873 journey west had promised a new life, but now she stood alone in the wilderness, miles from civilization with night approaching, and no idea which direction would lead to safety. Abigail tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear and hugged herself against the chill. Her husband James had died 3 months earlier from fever in Kansas, but she'd pressed on toward Pueblo where her cousin had settled. Now, with her wagon axle broken beyond repair and her supplies destroyed in the fire, the 22-year-old widow faced the unforgiving frontier alone. "Madam." "You all right?" The deep voice startled her. Abigail whirled around, her hand flying to her throat. A tall figure on horseback approached slowly, silhouetted against the setting sun. Her heart pounded. In the wild territories, strangers often brought more danger than salvation. As he drew closer, she could make out a weather-beaten face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Stubble darkened his jaw and his eyes. A startling shade of blue assessed her situation with a quick glance. "I mean no harm," he said, raising a hand in peaceful greeting. "Saw the smoke from a ways back. Thought someone might need help. My wagon." She began, then faltered as her voice broke. The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of hard work. His clothes were dusty from the trail but well kept. A revolver hung at his hip, but his manner was gentle as he approached. "Name's Knox Daniels," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "I've got a small ranch about 15 miles west of here." "Abigail Norwood," she replied, straightening her shoulders despite her fear. "I was headed to Pueblo to meet my cousin." Knox surveyed the wreckage of the wagon, then studied the darkening sky. "You're a fair piece from Pueblo, Miss Norwood, about 3 days' ride, and that's if you know the way." He glanced at her slender form in the travel-worn dress. "And these parts get dangerous after dark." "I don't know what to do," Abigail admitted, hating the tremor in her voice. She had prided herself on her independence since James's death, but now she felt utterly lost. Knox studied her face for a long moment. "There's a town called Silver Creek about half a day's ride from here. Got a decent hotel where you could stay while you figure things out." Hope flickered in Abigail's chest. "Could you point me in the right direction? Perhaps I could walk there before full dark." Knox shook his head, a slight smile softening his weathered features. "No, madam. That'd be suicide with night coming and wolves in these parts." He gestured toward his horse. "Follow me. I know the trail. I'll get you there safe." Abigail hesitated, eyeing the stranger. Her mother had raised her to be cautious, but her instincts told her this man could be trusted. With few options left, she nodded. "Let me see if anything survived the fire," she said, turning back to the wagon. Knox helped her search through the wreckage. They salvaged her carpetbag containing a spare dress, her husband's pocket watch, and a small leather pouch with her remaining money. Everything else was lost. "It'll have to do," she murmured, clutching the bag to her chest. Knox led his horse closer. "Copperhead here can carry us both to Silver Creek. We'll make it before full dark if we leave now." He helped her mount, then swung up behind her. Abigail stiffened at the unfamiliar proximity, but as they set off across the open plains, she found herself grateful for his warmth against the chilling wind. "What brings you out this way alone, Miss Norwood?" Knox asked as they rode. "My husband died 3 months ago," she answered, her voice steady. "We were heading to Pueblo together. I decided to continue on my own." "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "That's a difficult journey for anyone, let alone a woman alone. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Daniels." She felt rather than saw his smile. "I don't doubt that, madam." As they rode, Knox pointed out landmarks, distant mountains, unusual rock formations, a winding creek that glinted in the last rays of sunlight. He explained how to use them to find direction if ever lost again. "The land speaks if you know how to listen," he said. "Been out here 15 years now, came west after the war." "Which side?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Union," he replied simply. "But that's all behind us now. Out here, a man's judged by what he does, not where he came from." The sky darkened to purple, then deepened to black. Stars appeared, more than Abigail had ever seen in her life back in Pennsylvania. Knox kept them moving at a steady pace, occasionally pointing out constellations above. "There's Silver Creek," he finally said, as lights appeared in the distance. The town was small but busy, a collection of wooden buildings straddling a main street. Despite the late hour, the saloon was lit up, piano music spilling into the night. Knox guided his horse toward a 2-story building with a sign reading Silver Creek Hotel. He helped her dismount, her legs stiff after the long ride. When she stumbled slightly, his hand caught her elbow to steady her. "Thank you," she said, suddenly aware of how alone she'd been these past months. Human contact, simple kindness felt foreign now. Knox nodded, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Let's get you settled for the night." The hotel proprietor, a large woman named Mrs. Holloway, looked Abigail up and down with shrewd eyes. "Lost her wagon in a fire out on the plains," Knox explained before Abigail could speak. "She's heading to Pueblo to meet family." "Poor dear," Mrs. Holloway said, her expression softening. "I've got a room available. $2 for the night, includes breakfast." Abigail reached for her pouch, but Knox placed some coins on the counter. "I'll cover it," he said quietly. "Mr. Daniels, that's not necessary. Please, Miss Norwood, consider it a welcome to Colorado territory." Too exhausted to argue, Abigail thanked him. Mrs. Holloway handed her a key and directed her to a room upstairs. "Will you be staying too, Mr. Daniels?" the proprietor asked. Knox shook his head. "Need to check on some business in town. I'll find a place later." Abigail paused at the foot of the stairs. "Will I see you tomorrow?" She hadn't meant to ask the question aloud, but the thought of facing her journey alone again suddenly seemed daunting. Knox seemed surprised by the question, but nodded. "I'll be around. Get some rest, Miss Norwood." Upstairs, the small room was clean and simply furnished with a narrow bed, washstand, and chair. Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of the day's events. She had lost nearly everything she owned, but she was alive, and for the first time in months, she wasn't completely alone. She wondered about the quiet cowboy who had found her. There was a gentleness to him that contrasted with his rugged appearance. In his eyes, she'd glimpsed hints of past sorrows that matched her own. Abigail washed her face in the basin and changed into her spare dress. As she lay down, exhaustion swept over her. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Knox Daniels saying, "Follow me. I know the trail." Morning arrived with shafts of sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. Abigail awoke disoriented before remembering the events of the previous day. After dressing and pinning up her hair as neatly as possible, she made her way downstairs. The hotel dining room was nearly empty, but to her surprise, Knox sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee. He stood when he spotted her. "Morning, Miss Norwood. Thought you might want to discuss your plans over breakfast." Abigail nodded, joining him at the table. Mrs. Holloway brought over coffee and a plate of eggs and biscuits. "I've been thinking," Knox said after Abigail had taken a few bites. "The stage to Pueblo doesn't come through for another 4 days." Abigail's heart sank. 4 days in this hotel would deplete her limited funds. "I could take you," he continued. I've got business near Pueblo anyway, and it's safer than waiting for the stage. These roads can be dangerous." Abigail studied him. "Why would you go out of your way for a stranger, Mr. Daniels?" Knox looked into his coffee cup, as if searching for words. "I know what it's like to be lost in this country," he said finally. "When I first came west, a Cherokee scout helped me when I was in trouble. Said someday I'd have a chance to pass on the favor." He met her eyes. "Guess today's that day." Something in his straightforward gaze convinced her. "I'd be grateful for your help, Mr. Daniels, but I insist on paying you for your trouble." Knox shook his head. "No payment necessary. But we should get some supplies before heading out. You'll need proper gear for the trail." After breakfast, they visited the general store. Knox helped her select practical items: a heavy coat against the autumn chill, sturdy boots, a canteen, and provisions that would last the journey. "What about a weapon?" he asked as they stood before the gun display. Abigail hesitated. "I've never fired a gun." "Out here, it's a necessity, not a choice," Knox said gently. "I can teach you." They left the store with a small revolver added to their purchases. The shopkeeper provided a second horse, an older but reliable mare named Penny that Knox promised to return on his way back. As they prepared to depart, Abigail noticed how efficiently Knox packed their supplies, tying everything securely. His hands moved with practiced ease, strong and confident. "Been on many long journeys?" she asked. "Too many to count," he replied. "Spent years roaming before settling at my ranch." "What made you stop roaming?" Knox's expression grew distant. "Found a place that felt like somewhere I could breathe. Land with good water, sheltered from the worst weather." He adjusted Penny's saddle. "A man gets tired of wandering eventually." They set out from Silver Creek around midday. The terrain gradually changed as they rode, transitioning from open plains to more varied landscapes with scattered pine forests and rocky outcroppings. Knox set a steady pace, often riding alongside Abigail rather than ahead. "Tell me about your cousin in Pueblo," he said as they crossed a shallow creek. "Martha moved west 5 years ago with her husband. They have a dry goods store." Abigail guided her horse carefully through the water. "After James died, she wrote urging me to join them instead of returning east to my parents." "And you chose the harder path," Knox observed. Abigail smiled faintly. "I've never chosen the easy way. My father wanted me to marry the banker's son back home, a safe, predictable life. Instead, I fell in love with James, who dreamed of building something of our own in the West. And now I'm not sure what I want," she admitted. "Just not to go backward." As the afternoon wore on, Knox pointed out edible plants and showed her how to spot signs of water. When they stopped to rest the horses, he unpacked the revolver. "Hold it like this," he demonstrated, standing behind her. "Firm grip, but not too tight. Respect the weapon, don't fear it." Abigail felt awkward at first, the gun heavy and foreign in her hands. But Knox was a patient teacher, and by the time they continued their journey, she had managed to hit a tree trunk at 10 paces. "Not bad for your first try," he said with genuine approval. They made camp as twilight approached, in a sheltered spot beside a stand of cottonwoods. Knox built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of beans, jerky, and coffee. The desert air grew cold as darkness fell, and Abigail sat close to the flames, wrapped in her new coat. "Were you married, Mr. Daniels?" she asked as they ate. Knox stared into the fire. "No. Came close once, back in Missouri before the war." He took a sip of coffee. "Elizabeth was her name. Her father owned the biggest farm in the county. I was working as a ranch hand nearby." "What happened?" "The war," he said simply. "I joined up. When I came back, she'd married a doctor who'd stayed home." There was no bitterness in his voice, just a quiet acceptance. "Probably for the best. I wasn't the same man who left. They sat in companionable silence as the stars appeared overhead. Abigail found herself studying Knox's profile in the firelight, the strong jaw, the lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. There was a steadiness to him that she found comforting. "We should get some sleep," Knox said eventually. "Dawn comes early and we've got a long day tomorrow." He insisted she take the only bedroll while he slept with just his coat for cover. As Abigail lay looking up at the vast sky, she realized she felt safer with this man she barely knew than she had in months. Morning brought frost on the ground and their breath visible in the cold air. Knox was already awake, rekindling the fire when Abigail opened her eyes. They ate a quick breakfast before breaking camp. The second day's journey took them through more challenging terrain. The trail narrowed as they entered a region of steep hills and ravines. Knox rode ahead in the difficult sections, guiding Abigail through the safest paths. "Country gets rougher from here," he explained, "but it's faster than going around." Around midday, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Knox frowned at the sky. "Weather's turning. We need to find shelter before that storm hits." They pushed on at a faster pace, the wind rising steadily. Abigail's mare grew nervous as thunder rumbled in the distance. Knox pointed to a rocky outcropping ahead. "There's a shallow cave in those rocks. Should keep us dry." They had just secured the horses in a sheltered spot when the storm broke. Rain poured down in sheets as they huddled in the cave entrance, watching lightning split the sky. "Quite a show," Knox said, settling beside her on the stone floor. "It's beautiful in a frightening way," Abigail replied, pulling her coat tighter. Despite the blanket Knox draped around her shoulders, Abigail shivered as the temperature dropped. Without comment, he moved closer, offering his warmth. After a moment's hesitation, she leaned slightly against him. "How did you learn to read the land so well?" she asked. "Trial and error, mostly," he said. "And learning from those who were here first. Spent a winter with a Ute tribe when I was younger. They understand this country in their bones." As the storm raged outside, Knox told her about his life since coming west, the cattle drives, gold prospecting, bounty hunting, and finally finding his patch of land. Abigail found herself telling him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her dreams of adventure that had led her to marry James despite her parents' disapproval. "He was a good man," she said softly. "But I think even if he'd lived, I would have eventually realized we wanted different things from life." "What do you want?" Knox asked. Abigail considered the question. "Freedom, I suppose, not just from society's expectations, but freedom to discover who I truly am." She looked at him curiously. "Is that why you came west?" "For freedom, partly," he acknowledged. "Also to outrun memories. The war left scars that don't show on the outside." They fell silent, listening to the rain. The storm continued into the evening, forcing them to spend the night in the cave. Knox made a small fire near the entrance where the smoke could escape. They shared the last of the jerky and a can of peaches from their supplies. "Tell me about your ranch," Abigail said as they watched the flames. Knox's eyes brightened. "It's nothing fancy. 100 acres with a creek running through. Cabin needs work, but it's solid. Been slowly building a herd of cattle, 30 head now. You manage it alone. Hire help during branding and roundup. Rest of the time, it's just me." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Gets quiet sometimes." "I understand loneliness," Abigail said quietly. Their eyes met across the flames, and something shifted between them, a recognition of kindred spirits. Abigail looked away first, suddenly conscious of how intimate the small cave felt. They spread their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, but Abigail found sleep elusive. She was acutely aware of Knox's presence a few feet away, his steady breathing eventually lulling her to sleep. The storm cleared by morning, leaving behind a washed clean world. Puddles dotted the trail as they set out, but the sky above was a brilliant blue. The forced delay meant they needed to make good time, so they rode longer than planned, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking a broad valley. In the distance, they could see a town sprawled along a river. "Pueblo," Knox said, pointing. "We'll make it by nightfall." Abigail felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Soon she would be with her cousin, returning to civilization and its constraints. The freedom of the trail and Knox's undemanding company would end. "Martha will be worried," she said, more to herself than to Knox. "I sent word I'd arrive 2 days ago." Knox studied her face, having second thoughts about staying in Pueblo. "No, she stopped, surprised by her own hesitation. "It's the sensible choice." "Sensible doesn't always mean right," Knox observed quietly. They continued down toward the valley. As they rode, Knox pointed out various landmarks, explaining how the Arkansas River had shaped the region. His deep knowledge of the land and its history impressed Abigail. "How do you know so much about this area?" she asked. "Drove cattle through here many times," he replied. "A man learns to pay attention or pays with his life instead." As the sun began to set, they approached the outskirts of Pueblo. The town was larger than Silver Creek, with numerous businesses lining the main street. People hurried about their evening business, paying little attention to the two riders. "Where does your cousin live?" Knox asked. "Fifth Street, near the Mercantile," Abigail replied, suddenly nervous about the reunion. What would Martha think of her arriving with a strange man? They found the Weber dry goods store easily enough, with the family's living quarters located above. A plump woman with Abigail's auburn hair rushed outside as they dismounted. "Abigail, thank God!" Martha engulfed her in a tight embrace. "We've been frantic with worry." "I'm sorry," Abigail said, returning the hug. "There was an accident with my wagon." Martha held her at arm's length, examining her for injuries. Only then did she notice Knox standing quietly beside the horses. "And who might this be?" she asked, her tone cooler. "Knox Daniels, madam," he said, removing his hat. "Found Miss Norwood after her wagon caught fire. Thought it best to see her safely to Pueblo." Martha's expression softened slightly. "Then we owe you our gratitude, Mr. Daniels." She turned to Abigail. "Come inside, dear. You must be exhausted." Abigail hesitated, looking back at Knox. "Will you join us for supper, Mr. Daniels?" Before he could answer, Martha interjected. "Of course, the least we can do is feed you properly before you go on your way." Knox accepted with a nod, tying the horses to the hitching post. Martha's husband Edward, a balding man with kind eyes, welcomed them warmly. Their home above the store was modest but comfortable, with touches of Eastern refinement. As they sat down to a meal of roast chicken and potatoes, Abigail recounted the events of the past few days, careful to emphasize Knox's honorable behavior. "You were very fortunate Mr. Daniels happened along," Edward commented. "Those plains can be dangerous for anyone, especially a woman alone." "Where are you headed now, Mr. Daniels?" Martha asked. "My ranch is northwest of here," Knox replied. "Thought I'd rest a day in town before heading back." "You must stay at Harrison's Hotel," Edward suggested. "Clean rooms, fair prices." As the meal progressed, Abigail noticed the glances exchanged between Martha and Edward whenever Knox spoke. Their politeness masked an underlying wariness that made her uncomfortable. They saw him as an uncultured frontiersman missing the depth and intelligence behind his quiet demeanor. After supper, Knox rose to leave. "Thank you for your hospitality," he said formally. Abigail walked him to the door, aware of Martha hovering nearby. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Daniels," she said, extending her hand. "I wouldn't have made it here without your help." Knox took her hand briefly. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Miss Norwood." He placed his hat on his head. "Good luck with your new life." She watched from the doorway as he collected the horses and headed down the street. Only when he disappeared from view did she realize she might never see him again. Martha ushered her inside, chattering about getting her settled. "Edward's friend Judge Wilson is coming for dinner tomorrow. Such a distinguished gentleman and a widower. He's been most eager to meet you." Abigail recognized the familiar pattern, the quiet machinations of matchmaking that had dogged her even in Pennsylvania. Some things, it seemed, were the same everywhere. In the spare bedroom, she unpacked her meager belongings. The small revolver Knox had taught her to use lay wrapped in her spare shawl. She ran her fingers over it, remembering his patient instructions, his hand guiding hers on the weapon. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay awake, thinking of the journey and the man who had guided her. In just 3 days, Knox Daniels had shown her more about surviving in this new land than she'd learned in months of traveling with James. More than that, he'd treated her as an equal, not someone to be protected or directed. The next morning, Martha took her shopping to replace the items lost in the fire. As they walked the bustling streets of Pueblo, Abigail found herself scanning faces in the crowd, hoping for a glimpse of Knox. "The dressmaker can have 2 new dresses ready by next week," Martha was saying. "Edward's been doing well with the store, so please don't worry about the expense." "That's very generous," Abigail replied distractedly. Martha followed her gaze across the street. "You're not still thinking about that cowboy, are you?" "His name is Knox," Abigail corrected, more sharply than she intended. "And he saved my life." Martha's expression softened. "I'm sure he's a decent man, Abigail, but you need to think of your future. A life in the wilderness is no life for a woman of your upbringing." Abigail said nothing, but the words echoed her parents' warnings when she'd announced her intention to marry James. Everyone seemed to know what was best for her, except herself. That afternoon, she helped in the store while Martha prepared for dinner with Judge Wilson. The judge arrived precisely at 6, a silver-haired man in his 50s with an immaculate suit and practiced smile. He was polite, educated, and utterly predictable. Throughout dinner, he regaled them with stories of his legal career, occasionally directing questions to Abigail that seemed designed to assess her suitability as a potential wife. She answered politely, but without enthusiasm, her mind continually drifting to campfires under starlit skies. "Miss Norwood, you've barely touched your dessert," Judge Wilson observed. "I hope you're not finding our company tiresome." "Not at all," she replied quickly. "I'm just a bit tired from my journey." "Understandable. Martha told me about your ordeal. Fortunate that Cowboy came along when he did." "Yes," Abigail agreed, meeting his gaze, "though I prefer to think of it as making my own luck." The judge raised an eyebrow but said nothing more on the subject. After he left, Martha could barely contain her excitement. Wasn't he charming, and so established? "He's already hinted at calling again tomorrow." "Martha," Abigail said carefully, "I appreciate your kindness, but I've only just arrived. I'm not looking for a husband." Her cousin's face fell. "I thought after losing James." "Well, a woman alone has limited options, Abigail. Perhaps in the East, but out here, I'm beginning to think different rules apply." The next morning, Abigail rose early and went for a walk. The town was coming to life, shopkeepers opening their doors, workers heading to the sawmill, children running toward the schoolhouse. She found herself at the livery stable, drawn by the familiar sounds and smells of horses. As she peered inside the open doors, a voice behind her said, "Morning, Miss Norwood." She turned to find Knox leading his horse down the street. He was freshly shaven, his clothes clean but still distinctly those of a working rancher. "Mr. Daniels," she said, unable to hide her pleasure at seeing him. "I thought you might have left town already. Needed to take care of some business at the land office." He stopped beside her. "How are you settling in with your cousin?" "They've been very welcoming," she said carefully. Knox studied her face. "But," Abigail hesitated, then admitted, "Martha already has me half promised to a local judge." Something flickered in Knox's eyes, disappointment, perhaps before his expression returned to neutral. "Sounds like a good match for a lady like yourself." "Does it?" she challenged. "You don't know anything about what kind of match would suit me." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Fair point." He glanced up at the morning sun. "I was about to get some breakfast at the cafe down the street. Would you care to join me?" Abigail knew she should decline. Martha would be looking for her, and being seen in public with Knox would start tongues wagging. But the thought of returning to the suffocating politeness of her cousin's home held no appeal. "I'd like that," she said. The cafe was small but clean, with checkered curtains and the aroma of fresh bread. They sat at a corner table while a waitress brought coffee and plates of eggs and ham. "Have you decided how long you'll stay in Pueblo?" Knox asked as they ate. Abigail considered the question. "I haven't actually. Martha assumes it's permanent, but I never explicitly said so." "What would you do if not stay here?" She traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. "I don't know. When James was alive, the plan was to start a farm, but that was his dream more than mine." "And your dream?" Knox's blue eyes held genuine interest. "I used to think I knew," she said softly. "Now I'm not so sure." She looked up at him. "What about you? Is your ranch everything you hoped for?" Knox nodded slowly. "The land is good, but a place is just a place without people to share it with." He met her gaze steadily. "Gets lonely talking to cattle all day." There was something in his voice that made Abigail's heart beat faster. Before she could respond, the cafe door opened and Edward Weber walked in. He stopped abruptly when he saw them, then approached their table. "Abigail, Martha's been worried. She didn't know where you'd gone." His eyes shifted to Knox. "Mr. Daniels, I didn't realize you were still in town." "Just heading out today," Knox replied evenly. "Ran into Miss Norwood by chance." Edward nodded stiffly. "Well, we should be getting back, Abigail. Judge Wilson mentioned calling this afternoon." Abigail felt a flash of irritation at being summoned like a child, but she rose from her chair. "Of course." She turned to Knox. "Thank you for breakfast, Mr. Daniels." Knox stood, hat in hand. "My pleasure, Miss Norwood." As Edward ushered her from the cafe, Abigail glanced back to see Knox watching her, his expression unreadable. Back at the Webers' home, Martha was distressed. "Walking alone is dangerous enough, but to be seen dining with that man. What will people think?" "That I'm grateful to someone who saved my life," Abigail suggested dryly. Martha sighed. "You don't understand how things work here. Reputations are fragile. Judge Wilson is interested in you, but he expects a lady of refinement." "And if I'm not interested in Judge Wilson?" "Don't be foolish," Martha said, her voice softening. "He can offer you security, respectability. What could a rough cowboy possibly provide?" Abigail thought of Knox's quiet strength, his knowledge of the land, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. "Perhaps something more valuable." Martha stared at her aghast. "Surely you're not considering. Abigail, you barely know him." "I barely know Judge Wilson either," she pointed out. "That's different. His position in society speaks for him." Martha took Abigail's hands. "Please promise me you'll at least give the judge a fair chance before making any hasty decisions." Unable to deny her cousin's genuine concern, Abigail nodded reluctantly. Judge Wilson called that afternoon as promised, bringing flowers and an invitation to attend a concert the following evening. Abigail accepted politely, though her thoughts remained with Knox and whether he had already left town. The next day passed slowly. Abigail helped in the store, arranging displays and assisting customers. Through the front window, she watched the street, but there was no sign of Knox. By evening, she had resigned herself to the likelihood that he was gone, already miles away on the trail back to his ranch. She dressed for the concert without enthusiasm, allowing Martha to fuss over her hair and borrow a pair of pearl earrings. Judge Wilson arrived promptly, complimenting her appearance with practiced charm. The concert was held in the town hall, a string quartet from Denver performing classical pieces for Pueblo's elite. Abigail sat stiffly beside the judge, her mind wandering despite the beautiful music. She thought of Knox's description of his ranch, the creek running through it, the cabin that needed work. She imagined what it might look like in different seasons, covered in wildflowers in spring, dusted with snow in winter. "You seem distracted," Judge Wilson whispered during an intermission. "Is the music not to your liking?" "It's lovely," she assured him. "I'm just adjusting to town life again after so long on the trail." He nodded sympathetically. "It must have been dreadfully difficult for a gentlewoman such as yourself, but you're safe now, among civilized people." He patted her hand. No more sleeping rough or associating with uncouth elements. The condescension in his tone grated on her. "Some of those uncouth elements showed more true character than many civilized men I've known," she said coolly. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly, but he merely smiled. "Your loyal nature does you credit, my dear." After the concert, they walked back toward the Webbers' home. The night was clear and cool, the stars brilliant above the town's buildings, though fewer were visible than out on the open plains. "I hope you'll allow me to call on you regularly," Judge Wilson said as they reached the door. "I find your company most refreshing." "You're very kind," Abigail replied noncommittally. He smiled, clearly taking her response as encouragement. "Perhaps a picnic on Sunday after church." "The weather promises to be fine." Before she could answer, movement across the street caught her attention. A tall figure on horseback sat watching them from the shadows. Even in the darkness, she recognized Knox immediately. "Abigail," the judge prompted. "I'm sorry," she said, distracted. "A picnic would be pleasant." Satisfied, Judge Wilson bid her good night with a formal bow. As he walked away, Abigail remained on the porch, her eyes fixed on Knox. After a moment, he urged his horse forward, stopping at the edge of the yard. "Evening, Miss Norwood," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't," she assured him, stepping closer. "I thought you'd left town. Had intended to, got delayed." He glanced after the departing judge. "Looks like you're settling in well." "Appearances can be deceiving," she said. "What delayed you?" Knox shifted in the saddle. "Been thinking about our conversation, about dreams and such." He hesitated. "Thought maybe we could talk more, but I see you're spoken for." "I'm not," Abigail said quickly. "Judge Wilson is my cousin's idea, not mine." Hope flickered across Knox's face. "In that case, might you have time for a ride tomorrow morning? There's something I'd like to show you before I head back." Martha would disapprove, but Abigail found she cared less about that with each passing day. "I'd like that. What time?" "Sunrise. I'll bring a horse for you. I'll be ready." Knox touched his hat in farewell and rode off into the night. Abigail went inside, her heart lighter than it had been in days. She rose before dawn the next morning, dressing in her practical traveling clothes rather than the dresses Martha had lent her. She penned a quick note explaining she'd gone riding and would return by afternoon, leaving it on the kitchen table. Knox was waiting at the end of the street, leading a chestnut mare alongside his own mount. His face brightened when he saw her approaching. "Wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted as he helped her onto the horse. "Neither was I," she confessed with a small smile. They rode out of town as the sun crested the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Knox set a leisurely pace, heading north along the river before turning west into more rugged country. "Where are we going?" Abigail asked after they'd been riding for over an hour. "Place I discovered years ago," Knox replied. "Not far now." The trail led upward, winding through pine forests and rocky outcroppings. As they emerged from a dense stand of trees, the land opened before them, a small, hidden valley nestled among the hills. A crystal-clear lake occupied its center, reflecting the blue sky and surrounding peaks. Wildflowers dotted the grassy shores, adding splashes of color to the scene. "It's beautiful," Abigail breathed as they dismounted by the water's edge. "Thought you might like it," Knox said, seeming pleased by her reaction. "Not many know about this spot." "Found it when I was scouting land for my ranch." "Why didn't you settle here?" "Too high up for good grazing. Winter snows would make it impossible to reach for months." He spread a blanket on the grass. "But it's a fine place to visit when the weather's good." They sat looking out over the lake while Knox unpacked a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and dried fruit. Birds called from the surrounding trees, and occasionally fish jumped in the clear water, sending ripples across the surface. "I've been thinking a lot since we reached Pueblo," Knox said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "About what you said regarding knowing what you want in life." Abigail waited, sensing he had more to say. "When I found you by that burned wagon, I was just doing what any decent man would do," he continued. "Didn't expect to." He paused, searching for words. "Didn't expect you." "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Knox met her eyes directly. "Mean that in 3 days on the trail, I came to admire you more than any woman I've ever known. Your courage, your determination." He looked down at his hands. "Been trying to convince myself it was just circumstance, two strangers thrown together in a difficult situation. But these past days in town, not seeing you, I knew it was more." Abigail's heart quickened. "Knox, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not a wealthy man, got no fine house or position in society, but I've got good land, strong hands, and a heart that's been empty too long." He took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for promises, just asking if you might consider visiting my ranch before deciding to stay in Pueblo, see if there's something worth exploring between us." Abigail was silent, her mind racing. This man she'd known less than a week was offering something no one else had the chance to choose her own path rather than follow one laid out by others. "What about Martha and Edward?" she asked. "They've been kind to me." "They want what's best for you according to their lights," Knox acknowledged. "But only you can decide what that is." Abigail gazed across the lake, considering his words. The life Martha envisioned for her marriage to Judge Wilson, social engagements, a proper house in town offered security and respectability. But something in her soul rebelled at the predictability of it all. The same walls that would shelter her would also confine her. "When would we leave?" she asked finally. Joy flashed across Knox's face, quickly tempered with caution. "You're saying yes." "I'm saying I want to see more before I decide anything permanent," she clarified. "Your ranch included." Knox nodded, respecting her measured response. "Fair enough. We could leave tomorrow, be there in 2 days riding. I'll need to explain to Martha. She deserves that much, of course." He hesitated. "Will she try to stop you?" Abigail smiled wryly. "Probably. But I'm a grown woman who's already crossed half a continent. I can handle one concerned cousin." They spent a few more hours by the lake, talking easily about their pasts and potential futures. Knox told her more about his ranch, the improvements he planned, the neighboring farms, the small community forming in the valley. Abigail shared stories of her childhood and her brief marriage to James. With each exchange, The connection between them deepened. As the sun began its westward descent, they reluctantly mounted their horses for the return journey. Riding back toward Pueblo, Abigail felt lighter, as though a decision she hadn't realized she'd already made had been confirmed. Martha was waiting on the porch when they arrived, her expression a mixture of relief and disapproval. "We've been worried sick," she said, eyeing Knox coldly. "Edward was about to organize a search party." "I left a note," Abigail replied calmly, dismounting with Knox's assistance. "A very vague note." Martha turned to Knox. "Mr. Daniels, I appreciate what you did for my cousin, but I must insist—" "Martha," Abigail interrupted, "I need to speak with you privately." Inside the house, Martha's composure cracked. "Have you lost your mind? Running off with that man, no chaperone, no proper explanation. Judge Wilson called this morning and was most disappointed to find you gone." "I'm sorry if I worried you," Abigail said sincerely, "but I'm not a child and Knox is a good man." "Knox, is it?" Martha's eyebrows rose. "Abigail, you barely know him." "I know enough." Abigail took a deep breath. "He's invited me to visit his ranch. I've accepted." Martha stared at her in shock. "You cannot be serious. A respectable woman does not simply go off to a bachelor's remote homestead." "I survived months on the trail after James died," Abigail reminded her. "I think I can manage a visit to a ranch." "This isn't about your capability," Martha said, lowering her voice. "It's about your reputation. What will people think?" "I don't care what people think," Abigail replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I've spent my whole life trying to please others, my parents, then James. For once, I want to follow my own judgment." Martha sank into a chair, her expression troubled. "And your judgment tells you to trust this stranger?" "Yes," Abigail said simply. "It does." After a long silence, Martha sighed. "Edward won't approve. I know, but I'm not asking for approval, just understanding." Martha studied her face. "You're really determined to do this?" Abigail nodded. "We leave tomorrow morning." "Then at least let us help you prepare properly," Martha said reluctantly. "If you're going to be foolish, you might as well be practical about it." That evening, Edward voiced stronger objections but ultimately deferred to Abigail's decision. "You're a grown woman," he conceded, "but promise you'll write to let us know you're safe." "Of course," she agreed, touched by their genuine concern beneath the disapproval. The next morning, Knox arrived early with the borrowed mare. Martha had packed food for their journey and insisted on giving Abigail a small pistol that had belonged to her father. "Just in case your cowboy turns out to be less honorable than you believe," she whispered. Abigail hugged her cousin tightly. "Thank you for everything, Martha. I'll write soon." Knox tipped his hat to the Webbers. "I'll see she comes to no harm," he promised gravely. As they rode out of Pueblo, Abigail felt a curious mixture of excitement and apprehension. She was leaving behind the safe, conventional path for something unknown. Yet there was freedom in the uncertainty, a sense of writing her own story rather than following a prescribed plot. "Having second thoughts?" Knox asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "No," she replied honestly. "Just appreciating the choice." They traveled north and west, following the same path they'd taken the day before, but continuing beyond the hidden lake. The terrain grew more varied, stands of aspen with leaves turning golden, meadows dotted with late wildflowers, streams cutting through rocky valleys. Knox proved an engaging traveling companion, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the region's history. Unlike their journey to Pueblo, there was no rush now, no desperate need to reach a destination. They rode at a leisurely pace, stopping often to admire particularly beautiful vistas. That night, they camped beside a clear stream. Knox built a fire and prepared a simple stew with provisions Martha had provided. The autumn air grew chilly as darkness fell, but the fire kept them warm as they sat talking long into the night. "Tell me more about your ranch," Abigail requested, wrapped in a blanket against the evening cool. Knox's face lit up as he described his land, the south-facing slope, where he planned to plant an orchard, the natural spring that never ran dry, the meadows that bloomed with wildflowers in spring. "It's not much to look at yet," he admitted. "Cabin solid but plain. Been focusing on building the herd first, putting money into good breeding stock." "What made you choose cattle ranching?" "Seemed the best use of the land," he replied. "And I've always had a way with animals. Understand them better than people sometimes." "Yet you understand people better than most," Abigail observed. Knox smiled slightly. "Only the ones worth understanding." Their eyes met across the fire, and Abigail felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. There was an honesty in Knox that she found deeply appealing. No artifice, no social games, just a man comfortable in his own skin. "What if?" she began, then hesitated. "What if what?" "What if I don't fit in your world?" she asked softly. "I know nothing about ranching." "You know about courage and determination," Knox replied. "Rest can be learned if you've a mind to." He added another log to the fire. "Besides, I'm not asking you to be a rancher's wife, just asking you to see if my world might have a place for you in it." Abigail nodded, appreciating his lack of pressure. "Fair enough." They slept on opposite sides of the fire as before, but Abigail found herself more aware of Knox's presence. His breathing, the occasional shifting of his position, each sound reminded her of the growing connection between them. The second day of travel took them through increasingly rugged country. By mid-afternoon, Knox pointed to a distant ridge. "My land starts just beyond there. Another hour's ride." Anticipation built in Abigail's chest as they crested the ridge. Below them stretched a verdant valley, bisected by a winding creek bordered by cottonwoods. Cattle grazed in the meadows, and nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills stood a cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. "Home," Knox said simply. As they rode down into the valley, Abigail noticed details she hadn't seen from above: a corral beside a small barn, a vegetable garden fenced against wildlife, a paddock where several horses grazed. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. Knox looked pleased. "It's peaceful, at least. Been working on it for 5 years now." As they approached the cabin, the door opened, and an older man with grizzled gray hair stepped out, rifle in hand. When he recognized Knox, he lowered the weapon and waved. "That's Hank," Knox explained. "Neighbor who keeps an eye on things when I'm away." Hank watched curiously as Knox helped Abigail dismount. "Didn't expect you back with company," he said, his weathered face breaking into a grin as Knox made introductions. "Miss Norwood got stranded when her wagon burned," Knox explained. "She's visiting for a spell before deciding whether to settle in Pueblo." Hank's knowing look suggested he understood more than Knox had said. "Well, you're welcome here, miss. Ranch could use a woman's touch." After Hank departed for his own homestead a mile away, Knox showed Abigail around the property. The cabin was simply furnished but comfortable, with a main room featuring a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on history, science, and literature, evidence of Knox's autodidactic nature. "You can take my room," he said, showing her the larger bedroom with its hand-built furniture. "I'll sleep in the spare room." "I can't displace you," she protested. "Wouldn't be proper otherwise," he insisted. "Besides, spare room is comfortable enough." That evening, they prepared supper together in the small kitchen. Abigail found herself enjoying the domestic task, working alongside Knox as if they'd done so for years. They ate at a sturdy table Knox had crafted himself, discussing his plans for expanding the herd and improving the irrigation system for the garden. Later, sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues, Abigail felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since before James's death, perhaps even before that. The valley had a tranquility that soothed her spirit, and Knox's quiet companionship felt both exciting and comfortable simultaneously. "It's different than I imagined," she admitted. "Better or worse?" Knox asked. "Different," she repeated. "More complete somehow. I expected isolation, but there's a fullness to this place." Knox nodded in understanding. "Took me a while to recognize it too. It's not the same kind of community as a town, but it's here all the same. Neighbors may be miles apart, but they're there when needed." As darkness fell and stars appeared overhead, Abigail realized she wasn't ready to return to her cousin's home in Pueblo. Whatever this was between her and Knox deserved time to develop naturally, without Martha's anxious oversight or Judge Wilson's formal courtship. "Would it truly be possible for me to stay a while?" she asked. "To learn about this life." Knox's face registered surprise, then pleasure. "Nothing would make me happier." He hesitated. "But I don't want to damage your reputation. Folk out here can be just as judgmental as in town." "What if we had Hank's wife stay as chaperone?" Abigail suggested. "Would that satisfy propriety?" "Sarah would probably enjoy the company," Knox agreed. "She's been trying to befriend every new woman in the valley for years." The arrangement was quickly settled. Sarah Miller, Hank's cheerful wife, moved into the spare room the next day, while Knox took temporary residence in a small room off the barn. Sarah, a former schoolteacher from Ohio, took an immediate liking to Abigail and seemed delighted by the unfolding romance. "Been telling Knox for years he needs a partner, not just a housekeeper," she confided. "Man works too hard alone." The days that followed established a comfortable routine. Mornings began early with Knox tending the livestock while Abigail helped Sarah prepare breakfast. Afterward, Knox would teach Abigail about different aspects of ranch life, how to recognize signs of illness in cattle, the best way to preserve vegetables for winter, how to predict weather from cloud patterns. Abigail proved an eager student. Having grown up in town, she found each new skill both challenging and satisfying. Knox was a patient teacher, never condescending or impatient when she made mistakes. "You're a natural," he told her one afternoon as she successfully helped deliver a calf. "Most city folk would have fainted at the first sight of blood." "Perhaps I was meant for this life all along," she suggested, surprising herself with the thought. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire reading or talking while Sarah knitted or mended. Knox had a gift for storytelling, sharing tales of his early days in the West that made Abigail laugh and sometimes gasp in concern. She wrote to Martha as promised, explaining her decision to extend her stay. The reply, when it came, was predictably disapproving but resigned. "Judge Wilson has begun calling on the banker's daughter," Martha wrote, "so at least your reputation in town remains largely intact. Do be careful with your heart, dear cousin." But Abigail's heart had already made its decision. With each passing day, her feelings for Knox deepened. She admired his integrity, his quiet strength, his connection to the land. Most of all, she cherished how he valued her intelligence and spirit rather than merely her appearance or social graces. Knox, too, made no secret of his growing attachment. His eyes followed her movements when she crossed a room. His hand lingered when helping her mount a horse. In the evenings, they sat progressively closer by the fire, their conversations becoming more personal, more meaningful. One crisp October evening, Nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, Knox suggested a ride to watch the sunset from a nearby hilltop. Sarah gave them a knowing smile as they departed, making Abigail wonder if something had been planned. The hill offered a spectacular view of the entire valley. As the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in vivid oranges and pinks, Knox turned to Abigail. "These weeks with you have been the happiest of my life," he said quietly. "I know it's been a short time by most standards, but out here, we learn to recognize truth when we find it." Abigail's heart quickened. "And what truth have you found, Knox Daniels?" "That I love you," he said simply. "That I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." The directness of his declaration took her breath away. There was no pretense, no flowery speech, just honest emotion from a man who'd found his match. "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling right as they left her lips. "I didn't expect to find this when my wagon burned, but perhaps losing my way was the best thing that ever happened to me." Knox reached for her hand. "You never lost your way, Abigail, you just found a different path." His blue eyes held her steadily. "Will you marry me, make this ranch our home together?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Nothing would make me happier." He kissed her then, gentle at first, then with growing passion as the sky blazed with color around them. When they finally parted, Abigail laughed with pure joy. "What is it?" Knox asked, smiling at her happiness. "I was just thinking when you found me by that burned wagon and said, 'Follow me.' I know the trail. You had no idea where we'd end up." "Maybe not the exact destination," he agreed, "but I knew it would be somewhere worth going." They married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch. Hank served as witness, and the local circuit riding preacher officiated. Sarah decorated the cabin with autumn flowers and prepared a feast for the small gathering of neighbors who attended. Martha and Edward came despite their reservations, bringing a handsome cedar chest as a wedding gift. Seeing Knox and Abigail together, the genuine love between them evident in every glance and gesture, even Martha had to admit they seemed well matched. "He's not what I would have chosen for you," she told Abigail privately, "but perhaps he's what you needed all along." "He is," Abigail confirmed, watching as Knox chatted easily with Edward across the room. "He saw me for who I really am, not who someone wanted me to be." The first year of marriage brought challenges as well as joys. Winter descended on the valley with fierce snowstorms that sometimes left them isolated for weeks. The cattle required constant attention in the harsh conditions, and running a ranch household demanded skills Abigail was still developing. But they faced each challenge together. Knox never treated her as fragile or incapable, instead valuing her intelligence and determination. They established a true partnership, each contributing their strengths to build their shared life. Spring brought new calves, fields of wildflowers, and the news that Abigail was expecting their first child. Knox's joy was boundless, his protective instincts tempered by respect for Abigail's resilience. "Don't you dare treat me like I'll break," she warned him when he tried to take over her garden work. "Wouldn't dream of it," he replied with a grin. "But you can't blame a man for wanting to care for the woman he loves." Their son, William James Daniels, was born on a crisp autumn day almost exactly a year after they'd met. He had Knox's blue eyes and Abigail's determined spirit, evident from his first lusty cries. "He's perfect," Knox whispered, holding his son with careful hands that had wrestled steers and built fences, but now cradled new life with infinite tenderness. As William grew, the ranch prospered. Knox's careful breeding program produced hardier cattle that fetched better prices. They added a second story to the cabin, planted the orchard Knox had envisioned, and established a reputation for hospitality among travelers passing through the valley. 3 years after William's birth, their daughter Elizabeth joined the family. With 2 healthy children and a thriving ranch, Abigail sometimes marveled at how different her life was from what she'd once expected. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Knox surprised her with a small carved wooden box. Inside lay a compass, its needle pointing steadily north. "What's this for?" she asked, turning the instrument in her hands. "To remind us both," he said, pulling her close. "Sometimes getting lost leads to exactly where you're meant to be." Abigail smiled, thinking of that desperate day when a stranger on horseback had found her beside a burned wagon. "Follow me. I know the trail," he'd said, and he had not to the destination she'd planned but to the home her heart had sought all along. "I was never really lost," she said, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. "Just waiting for you to find me." 10 years after that fateful meeting, the Daniels Ranch had grown into one of the most respected in the region. Their home, expanded and improved, stood as a testament to shared vision and hard work. William, now a lanky 9-year-old, showed his father's affinity for horses and the land. Elizabeth, at 6, had her mother's quick mind and independent spirit. And their youngest, 2-year-old Thomas, toddled after his siblings with determination. On warm summer evenings, the family often sat on the wide porch Knox had built, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. Abigail would sometimes catch her husband's eye across their children's heads, exchanging a smile that acknowledged the blessing of their shared journey, a journey that began when a cowboy found a woman who'd lost her way home and said the words that changed both their lives forever. "Follow me. I know the trail."